On July 23, 2025, after nearly 3 years of legal battles, the fate of the man who brutally murdered 4 young students was finally decided. But it wasn't just the sentence that left the courtroom shaken. It was the words of one of the victims' mothers. Christy Goncalves, in a moment of unimaginable pain, spoke to Bryan Kohberger in a way that would haunt him forever. But were those words too much? Was she wrong for speaking them? And is there a punishment worse than life behind bars? This video dives into Christy Goncalves' chilling prophecy, one that now seems to be happening in real time. What happens when a mother's grief turns into a warning that cannot be ignored? Stay with us as we explore how the prophecy came true and what it means for the man at the center of it all. On July 23, 2025, Christy Goncalves, a mother who had lost her daughter to a brutal crime, stood in a courtroom and delivered words that would ripple across the nation. But what Christy said was not born out of love or mercy. It was a prophecy. "Hell will be waiting for you," she said to Bryan Kohberger, the man who murdered her daughter Kaylee. Those words didn't just hang in the courtroom. They resonated beyond that space, echoing into the cold walls of the prison where Kohberger would spend the rest of his life. But before we begin to understand the gravity of her words, we need to understand who Christy Goncalves was long before she became a mother fighting for justice. Christy was born on November 8, 1977, in Northern California, into a modest family that would shape her into the woman she would become. She was the third child in a family of 5 siblings. Christy was never the rebellious one, nor was she the one who stole the spotlight. Instead, she was the peacekeeper, the steady presence who made sure things ran smoothly at home. Growing up, Christy learned the importance of relationships, empathy, and hard work. She carried those values into her adult life, and they would later become the foundation of her family life. As a young woman, Christy had big dreams, just like many others. She was the kind of person who believed in the power of love and family, who saw the world as a place full of possibilities. She never imagined that her life would take such a tragic turn. But everything changed when she met Steve Goncalves in 1995. Steve was her anchor, her partner in all things. Their love was quick, but it was deep, and before long they were married in 1996. Together, they would build a family, raise children, and create a life that would one day be tested in unimaginable ways. Their marriage, though strong, wasn't without its struggles, like any long-term relationship. But through every challenge, Christy and Steve stuck together, supporting each other through the ups and downs of life. In North Idaho, they found a quiet place to raise their children, away from the distractions of the world, where they could focus on family. They celebrated the births of their 5 children, Olivia, Kaylee, Autumn, Aubrey, and Stephen. But as with all families, their bond would eventually be tested by tragedy. Kaylee was the firstborn, and from the moment she entered their lives, she was the force that kept everything moving. Christy often describes her daughter as a go-getter, someone who was never content with the status quo. Kaylee's bright energy was felt by everyone who knew her, whether it was her laughter, her curiosity, or her deep ambition. Christy watched as Kaylee grew from a playful child into a strong-willed young woman. She had dreams of her own, and she was ready to take on the world. But no one, not even Christy, could have foreseen the horror that was about to strike their family. Christy's world was centered on her children, and Kaylee was no exception. Kaylee was the eldest, and their relationship was something truly special. Christy often said, "Kaylee was a huge part of our family. The dynamics of our family will never be the same." That statement wasn't just a reflection of her love for her daughter. It was a warning of the depth of pain that would soon follow. In Christy's own words, Kaylee's absence left a void that no amount of time or healing would ever fully fill. The grief Christy felt was deep, all-consuming, and unlike anything she had ever experienced. A mother's love for her child is unconditional, but to lose that child in such a senseless way, To have your whole world shattered in an instant is a pain that no one can truly understand unless they have experienced it themselves. But even in the midst of unimaginable grief, Christy found a wellspring of strength that would carry her forward. Steve was by her side, and together they fought not just for their own survival, but for justice for Kaylee. Their marriage, though tested by loss, became even more unbreakable in the face of tragedy. They became each other's lifeline, supporting one another as they navigated the dark waters of their grief. Their unwavering commitment to one another was not just about enduring loss, it was about honoring Kaylee's memory. For Christy, her role as a mother didn't end with Kaylee's death. It transformed into something much more profound. She became a relentless advocate for her daughter's justice, and in doing so, she also became a voice for the other victims: Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Christy's personal tragedy gave her a new purpose: to see that the man responsible for taking her daughter's life would never be allowed to escape the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just about punishment. This was about ensuring Kaylee's legacy would never be forgotten. It was during the sentencing hearing on July 23, 2025, that Christy found the courage to speak directly to Bryan Kohberger. It was the moment she had waited for, the moment she could finally look the man in the eye and tell him exactly what she thought. She didn't hold back. "Hell will be waiting for you," she said. The words rang out, raw and unfiltered. Christy had reached the point where there was nothing left to lose. No more sugarcoating the truth. Kohberger, the man who thought he could control everything, had underestimated the fury of a mother whose child had been taken from her. Her statement wasn't just anger, it was prophetic. She didn't just wish for his suffering, she knew it was coming. As she spoke those words, Christy was already envisioning the fate Kohberger would face in the prison system. He would be stripped of everything he once thought made him powerful. Christy had seen what awaited him long before Kohberger ever took his first step into a cell. He would be treated with the same disrespect he had shown the world, only magnified in the harsh environment of prison. Karma, as Christy knew, was coming for him. What Christy spoke into existence on that fateful day would soon become reality. Bryan Kohberger was about to face a fate far worse than he ever expected. But what would it look like? Would the prophecy Christy spoke come to pass in the unforgiving world of prison life? Karma had found its mark, but would it be enough to break him? On July 23, 2025, in a courtroom that felt heavy with the weight of loss, Christy Goncalves stood and faced Bryan Kohberger, the man who had taken her daughter, Kaylee, from her in the most brutal of ways. The world was watching, waiting to hear what this mother, now forever defined by her grief, would say to the man who had shattered her life. But what Christy said was not just a mother's grief. It was a prophecy, one that would soon begin to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. Christy began her statement calmly, but there was an unmistakable edge to her voice, one that had been forged through months of pain and anguish. "Thank you, Your Honor. I never imagined having to speak to someone so devoid of humanity." Her words rang out in the courtroom, not just as a statement, but as a confrontation with the man who had taken everything from her. Her eyes never left Kohberger, and for the first time in months, Christy was speaking not just as a mother, but as a woman who had found her voice, a voice that had been silenced by grief, but was now a tool of justice. She paused, steadying herself. The court was silent, every ear attuned to what was coming next. "For a long time I didn't think I'd find the words low enough to meet you where you are. But now I realize this isn't about you. It's about what you've done to me. And I need you to hear it." There was a quiet intensity in her words, a realization that her pain wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who had been impacted by Kohberger's actions. For every person who had to live with the aftermath of his violence, Christy was now the one who would speak the truth. "When you murdered my daughter, Kaylee Jade Goncalves, you didn't just take her life, you shattered others." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Christy's words carved through the air. "You attacked what you could never be." With these words, Christy was laying bare the truth of Kohberger's motivations. He had tried to control, manipulate, and dominate, but in the end, all he had done was attack the very essence of Kaylee's life, a life filled with potential, joy, and love. Kohberger had taken that life, and in doing so, he had not only murdered a young woman, but had set into motion the destruction of a family. Christy continued, her voice unwavering. And in doing so, you left a trail of devastation far beyond that house. She wasn't just talking about the crime scene. She was talking about the lasting impact Kohberger's actions had on every person who knew Kaylee. The devastation reached far beyond that night, beyond the walls of that house. It had reverberated through the hearts of everyone who loved Kaylee, and that pain would never be undone. Christy's grief was not just a personal loss. It was a collective loss, a loss felt by her family, her community, and the world. "You stole my peace," Christy said, her voice raw but determined. "You've altered my every waking moment, every sleepless night, the way I view the world, people, safety, trust. It's all been changed by your cruelty." The emotional weight of these words was heavy, and it was clear that Christy wasn't just speaking about the immediate aftermath of the crime. She was speaking about the permanent changes to her life, changes that no one could ever fully understand unless they had experienced the loss of a loved one in such a brutal way. Kohberger had taken more than just Kaylee's life. He had taken Christy's sense of security, her ability to trust, her ability to feel safe in the world. Christy's words continued, now more personal, reflecting the deep emotional toll she had carried every day since Kaylee's death. "I no longer recognize parts of myself. Joy is harder to find. Laughter feels foreign." These words weren't just a reflection of her pain. They were an insight into the long-term psychological effects of such a loss. Her entire world had been turned upside down, and she was now left to navigate a life in which Kaylee's absence was always felt, in every small moment, in every holiday, in every birthday that would now serve as a memorial. Christy didn't hold back. She spoke openly about the sorrow and the rage that she had to live with. "The world moves forward, but I'm suspended in places of sorrow and rage. You've taken from me something that can never be restored." Christy was living in a perpetual state of emotional limbo, her grief not just an emotional wound, but an overwhelming force that changed the way she saw the world. Every milestone, every celebration, was tainted by the absence of her daughter. For Christy, the world had moved on, but for her, it would never be the same again. "The grief sits with me every day, some days quietly, and other days so loud it drowns out everything else," she continued, her voice trembling slightly as the weight of the loss hit her once more. "The emotional toll you've inflicted on me is immeasurable. I live with a constant ache with birthdays that are now memorials, with holidays that feel hollow, with empty chairs that scream louder than words ever could." These words were the reality of Christy's life, a life now defined by the absence of Kaylee. She was living in a world where the simplest things, like sitting at the dinner table, had become a constant reminder of the hole left by her daughter's death. Then, Christy shifted her focus, bringing attention to Kohberger's own failings. "But for you, as a person working on a PhD in criminal justice, you really didn't think this one through," Christy said, her words sharp. "You're not that good. In fact, you're not good at anything. You couldn't secure a job. You couldn't get along with others. You couldn't even get a female to look in your direction. All because you are pathetic." Christy's words here were a direct hit to Kohberger's sense of self, a man who thought his intellect and education would shield him from the consequences of his actions. Christy wasn't just calling him a killer, she was stripping him of everything that he had once considered his strength, his perceived intellect, his control, his power. In her eyes, he was nothing but a failure, and she made sure the world saw him as such. And then came the chilling words that made everyone in that courtroom realize the true extent of Christy's prophecy. "Now you're a joke in this courtroom. I wish I could crown you with a jester hat to complete your orange jumpsuit clown look." Kohberger's image, once that of a confident criminology student, was now reduced to nothing more than a clown. Christy wasn't just condemning him for his actions, She was ripping away the last remnants of his pride. Christie's words then turned to the most profound and powerful part of her statement. A dead killer doesn't kill again, so while I'm disappointed the firing squad won't get to take their shots at you, I'm confident that the men in prison will have their way with you in more ways than one. You will finally get what you wanted. Physical touch. Just probably not how you were expecting it. She spoke these words not with regret, but with a fierce sense of justice. Christie knew that Kohberger's life in prison would be a nightmare he could never escape from. You haven't beat the system. You've simply entered a new one where the rules are cruel, and the consequences will never end, she said. You are entering a place where no one will care who you are and no one ever will respect you. You will be forgotten, discarded, used, and erased. Christie's words here were not just a prediction. They were a reality that Kohberger would soon face. He would no longer be the PhD student, the intellectual. He would be just another man in prison, no better than the lowest of the low. Christie concluded her statement with an unforgiving tone. You will always be remembered as a loser, an absolute failure. And when those prison doors slam shut behind you, I hope that sound echoes in your heart for the rest of your meaningless days. It was a final blow, a reminder to Kohberger that, despite everything he thought he was, he would be nothing in the eyes of the world. May you continue to live your life in misery. You are officially the property of the state of Idaho, where your fellow inmates are anxiously awaiting your arrival. These words were a sickening reminder that Christie's prophecy was about to become his reality. Finally, Christie delivered a final, biting message, one that echoed Kaylee's younger sister's words. You may have received A's in high school and college, but you're going to be getting big D's in prison. The last laugh was not his to have. As Christie's words echoed through the courtroom, her prophecy was set in motion. Bryan Kohberger, once confident and self-assured, was now a man facing an uncertain, brutal future behind bars. But what had led him to this moment? What was the driving force behind his actions? To truly understand how this man could commit such atrocities, we must first look at the crime that would change everything, starting with the victims and the house that would forever be linked to this tragedy. Let's take our mind back to what really happened. On November 13th, 2022, Kaylee Goncalves, her roommate Madison Mogan, and two other University of Idaho students, Zana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, were violently murdered in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. The house, which had been a place of comfort and familiarity for the four students, quickly turned into a crime scene marked by unspeakable brutality. The details of the attack remain seared in the minds of the public, each new revelation adding to the horror of what occurred that night. Kaylee and Madison, who had been out at a local bar that evening, returned home just after 2 a.m. The house, located on King Road, was quiet, the kind of place where young people would typically retreat for rest after a night out. Zana and Ethan, who had been together earlier that night, were also asleep on the first floor of the house. The attacker, Bryan Kohberger, a criminology PhD student, had been watching the house for days, planning the attack, waiting for the right moment to strike. By the time Kaylee and Madison had returned home, Kohberger had already infiltrated the house, armed with a fixed blade knife. The killings were swift and brutal. The victims were targeted in their sleep, with Kaylee and Madison found on the second floor of the house, while Zana and Ethan were located on the first floor. The murder weapon was confirmed to be a fixed blade knife, and the brutality of the attack left the victims dead in the house. Only two surviving roommates were unharmed. The crime was not just about taking their lives. It was about the violent and chilling manner in which they were stolen from the world. What made the crime even more disturbing was the absence of forced entry. The killer knew the house, knew the victims, and had somehow gained access without anyone being aware. Investigators later discovered that two other roommates who were also in the house during the attack did not hear anything. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, who were sleeping on the first floor, did not wake up during the attack and were only aware of the horror after the police arrived. This detail only added to the mystery of how the crime could have occurred without raising any alarms. The chilling nature of the crime was compounded by the lack of motive. These were not random victims. They were students living in a college town, leading normal lives. Their only connection to each other was their shared residence at King Road. And yet Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan would never leave the house alive. The motive for such a brutal attack remained unclear, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Why them? What had led Kohberger to commit such an atrocity? In the aftermath of the murders, the town of Moscow, usually quiet and peaceful, was thrust into a state of fear. The community was on edge, and students from the university, along with local residents, anxiously awaited answers. But those answers would not come easily. As days turned into weeks, the police had no immediate suspects, no leads to follow, only the grim reality that a killer was on the loose in their small town. The sense of dread hung over the university, and fear spread rapidly through the student body. While the community mourned the loss of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan, the investigation into the crime began. Despite the lack of a suspect, the police worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. They focused on every detail, trying to find any trace of evidence that would lead them to the killer. The police canvassed the area, interviewed neighbors, and reviewed security footage from around the house. At the same time, rumors began to spread across campus. People speculated about who could be responsible, but no one knew for sure. Everyone felt the fear of the unknown. Who could have done this? The fear became palpable, and the desire for answers became urgent. The investigation would continue for weeks, but it wasn't until December 30th, 2022, that the breakthrough finally came. Bryan Kohberger, a graduate student at Washington State University, was arrested in connection with the murders. His arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The fact that Kohberger was a criminology PhD student studying criminal justice raised immediate questions. How could someone with such a background be capable of such brutality? But the arrest was just the beginning. Kohberger's background as a criminology student would become a key part of the narrative. Investigators would later discover that Kohberger had been living only a few miles away from the crime scene. More chilling still was the revelation that his car, a white Hyundai Elantra, had been seen near the victim's house on the night of the murders. He had been tracking the victims in the days leading up to the attack, a fact that only deepened the horror of his actions. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. The people of Moscow and the families of the victims were left in shock. The Goncalves family, in particular, found themselves thrust into the national spotlight. Christy and Steve Goncalves, along with the families of the other victims, became vocal advocates for justice, vowing to see Kohberger pay for what he had done. They demanded answers and sought the harshest possible penalties for him. As news of the arrest spread, the case garnered national attention. The details of the crime, the investigation, and the arrest of Kohberger all played out under the scrutiny of the public eye. People across the country were horrified by what had happened in Moscow, but for Christy and Steve Goncalves, this was just the beginning of a long fight for justice, a long and painful legal battle. With his background as a criminology student, many began to question what drove him to commit such a heinous act. Was it the obsession with criminal justice, or something deeper? The answers would come, but they would be even more chilling than anyone could have imagined. Bryan Kohberger, a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, seemed to fit the mold of a promising academic, a man driven by intellectual pursuits and an ambition to understand the darker side of human behavior. But behind this image, a far more complex and troubling reality existed. Kohberger was socially awkward, withdrawn, and had always struggled to form meaningful connections with others. His peers at the university described him as a loner, someone who often kept to himself and rarely participated in the social dynamics of student life. Those who interacted with him described a man whose behavioral traits raised more than a few eyebrows. While his academic aptitude was unquestioned, there was something unsettling about his demeanor. Kohberger had a history of interactions with law enforcement long before the murders. His academic work in criminology often involved researching criminal behavior, and he had even assisted in studies with law enforcement officers, creating a sense of detachment from reality. He wasn't just learning about crime, he was becoming familiar with the systems and behaviors that allowed it to flourish. Some experts believe his fascination with criminality went beyond mere academic interest. It was as though Kohberger wanted to understand the mechanics of crime so he could control it. But controlling what? That was the chilling question. His family background was equally complex. Bryan Kohberger was born on November 21, 1994, and raised in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, in a family that, on the surface, seemed normal. He had 3 siblings, and despite what might have appeared to be a loving family dynamic, it was clear that Kohberger's relationships with his parents and siblings were fraught with tension. Some of his family members described him as eccentric and hard to relate to, but others didn't see the warning signs that would later lead to tragedy. Bryan's father, Michael Kohberger, was a man of few words, and his mother, Marianne, was more involved in the household, but also faced challenges in communicating effectively with Bryan. Bryan's relationship with his siblings was somewhat strained. His younger brother, Kurt Kohberger, was the one person with whom he seemed to have a closer bond, but even that relationship was marked by distance. Bryan's sibling dynamics seemed to reflect his overall difficulty in forming lasting, meaningful connections. His family often struggled to understand him, and there were hints that Bryan had always felt like an outsider in his own home. The isolation he experienced throughout his life only seemed to fuel his darker inclinations. Was this isolation something that contributed to his later crimes? Despite his academic success, Kohberger's personal life was anything but stable. His fixation on criminal justice became an obsession that overtook every other aspect of his life. He couldn't seem to form any deep personal connections with others, including his peers or family. His inability to interact with others in a meaningful way only deepened his alienation. But it wasn't just social isolation that characterized his life. Psychologists who later examined his behavior noted that he exhibited classic signs of someone who had a deep need for control, a need that would manifest in ways that no one could have predicted. Kohberger's psychological profile revealed a man whose actions were driven by a combination of intellectual arrogance and psychopathic tendencies. He viewed the world through a lens of control and power, believing that his academic knowledge could shield him from the consequences of his actions. It wasn't just about committing a crime for him. It was about proving his superiority, about asserting control over others in a way that aligned with his distorted view of the world. But for all of his academic achievements and his obsession with criminal justice, Kohberger's life was marked by a lack of empathy and an inability to understand the real-world consequences of his actions. His intellectual pursuits, which might have seemed noble on the surface, only fueled his sense of isolation and arrogance. He believed he could outsmart the system, but what he didn't realize was that the system was already coming for him, just waiting to expose his flaws. As the investigation into his past and his behavior deepened, one thing became clear. Kohberger was living a double life. On one hand, he was a respected student in the criminology department, a man of intellect. But on the other hand, there was a darker side of him that no one could see, an individual capable of unimaginable violence, someone who had allowed his need for control to manifest in a way that would lead him to murder. The night of November 13th, 2022, was the culmination of this dark trajectory. Kohberger had stalked the victims for weeks, studying their routines, learning their movements. His attack on Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan was methodical, calculated, planned for weeks before he made his move. The chilling nature of the crime was not just about the violence, but about the fact that Kohberger had chosen these victims with the precision of someone who had studied criminal behavior, someone who thought they could execute the perfect crime. But there was something Kohberger didn't anticipate: the human consequences of his actions. The lives he had taken were not just statistics. They were real people with families who would fight for justice. And in that fight, Goncalves was leading the charge. But how would Christie's prophecy unfold? Would Kohberger's time in prison become the torment that she had predicted, or would he continue to believe he could outsmart the system? But before we answer that, we want to take a moment to thank you for your incredible support. We invite you to join our channel's membership. As a member, you'll gain exclusive access to in-depth content, special behind-the-scenes footage, and more gripping stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support helps us continue telling these important stories. Don't miss out. Become a member today and be part of our community dedicated to bringing these powerful stories to life. When Bryan Kohberger was sentenced on July 23, 2025, the world witnessed the culmination of not only a legal battle, but of a mother's chilling prophecy. Christy Goncalves had warned him, "Hell will be waiting for you." On that day, Kohberger was sentenced to life without parole for the brutal murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. He had pled guilty to all charges and had avoided the death penalty in exchange for a life sentence, but this wasn't a victory for him. This was the beginning of a new nightmare, one that Christy had foreseen. After being sentenced, Kohberger was transferred to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, where he began his life behind bars. The prison was a place designed for the worst of the worst, a place where Kohberger's background in criminology and his previous perceptions of the criminal justice system would offer him no refuge. He was immediately placed in solitary confinement, known as the SHU, Special Housing Unit, where he spent 23 hours a day in isolation, allowed only 1 hour of exercise in a small cage. Kohberger, once a man who believed in the power of intellect and control, now found himself powerless in the face of a system that was merciless and unforgiving. In the months following his transfer, reports began to surface about the torment Kohberger was enduring at the hands of fellow inmates. His time in solitary confinement was far from peaceful. He was subjected to psychological harassment from the moment he entered the facility. Inmates who had nothing to lose began using the ventilation system to torment him. They would whisper threats and insults through the metal grates, their voices muffled and disembodied, but never quiet enough to escape Kohberger's ears. These taunts became a part of his daily existence, a constant reminder that he was no longer in control. But the vent harassment was just the beginning. Kohberger soon learned that the prisoners around him were fully aware of who he was. His name was no longer associated with academic achievement or future potential. He was simply a killer in a room full of people who had no respect for him. It wasn't just the mental abuse that wore him down. It was the sheer isolation that had begun to break his mind. Experts who reviewed Kohberger's case in the aftermath of his imprisonment noted that solitary confinement was one of the most damaging forms of punishment. Over time, psychological issues began to take hold. He was becoming paranoid, anxious, and increasingly unstable. The harassment didn't stop with just whispers through the vents. Some inmates, keen to add to his suffering, took to speaking through the toilet pipes, creating an environment of constant dread. The sound of their voices traveling through the plumbing was enough to keep Kohberger on edge every single day. The constant noise, the taunts, and the psychological games played on him were relentless. This type of torment is a strategy employed in many prisons to break down those who believe they are untouchable. Kohberger, the man who once thought he could outsmart the system, now found himself its victim. Larry Levine, a prison consultant, put it simply, he's going to have to suck it up. No amount of legal knowledge could shield him from the cruelty of his fellow inmates. In addition to the harassment, Kohberger's mental state continued to deteriorate. Experts familiar with cases of prolonged isolation like his noted the psychological toll it could take. Without human interaction, without any form of meaningful communication, the mind begins to crack under the pressure. Kohberger's emotional breakdown was not just a matter of time, it was a predictable outcome. Solitary confinement had already begun to strip away the last remnants of his stability. He filed several grievances in the early months of his incarceration, claiming that the sexual harassment and threats from inmates were escalating. In one of his complaints, Kohberger described an inmate who threatened him with violent sexual language. The harassment was not just verbal, it had become personal. Despite these claims, the prison system appeared largely indifferent to his complaints. Chris McDonough, a former homicide detective with inside sources at the prison, noted that while Kohberger was not in immediate physical danger, the mental abuse he faced was nearly impossible to escape. "He's not being physically hurt," McDonough explained, "but they are breaking him down mentally." This breakdown was further exacerbated by sleep deprivation. Inmates began to organize shifts to keep Kohberger awake by yelling through the vents, creating a torturous cycle of sleeplessness. The isolation, the harassment, and the sleep deprivation began to affect Kohberger's ability to think clearly. His world had shrunk to the size of his tiny prison cell, a place where the only sound was the voice of his tormentors and the ever-present hum of isolation. In the midst of this chaos, Kohberger was left with nothing but time to reflect on his actions. His life, once filled with promise, now seemed irrelevant. He was no longer the PhD student, the aspiring criminologist. He was just another inmate, another man in a sea of forgotten souls, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. As Christy Goncalves' prophecy began to unfold within the cold walls of prison, Kohberger's torment was just beginning. But what lay ahead for him? Could the punishment be enough to break him? Or was there more to this prophecy than anyone could have anticipated? The sound of prison doors slamming shut behind him echoed a reality that no degree, no criminal knowledge could prepare him for. Since the moment Kaylee's life was taken, Christy Goncalves has not remained silent. Her journey, one that began with unimaginable grief, has transformed into a mission to ensure that her daughter's legacy is not just remembered, but honored through action. In the wake of the brutal murders, Christy became an unwavering voice for justice. She knew from the start that her role was not just to mourn, but to make sure Kaylee's story was told in a way that would lead to accountability. Christy's mission was no longer just about mourning. It was about fighting for justice in her daughter's name. The media quickly turned its focus to Christy and Steve Goncalves, the parents of the young woman whose life was senselessly cut short. Christy, though devastated, found herself thrust into the public eye. She began participating in interviews, speaking openly about her daughter's life, her dreams, and the horrific reality that had claimed it. She didn't shy away from sharing her pain. Instead, she used it as a platform for advocacy. Whether in front of the camera or behind the scenes, Christy's voice echoed far beyond the confines of her grief. In countless interviews, Christy spoke about what it felt like to lose a daughter in such a violent, inexplicable way. Her words were always filled with raw emotion, but they also carried a determined edge. One of the most memorable moments came when she was asked about Kaylee's legacy. Christy replied with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "Kaylee was more than just my daughter. She was a light in this world, and I'm going to make sure that light never goes out. I'll fight for her until the end." Her words resonated with viewers across the nation. People from all walks of life were drawn to her message. She wasn't just a grieving mother, she was a warrior for justice, and the world was listening. But Christy's advocacy didn't stop at interviews. She began taking part in public speaking engagements, where she shared not only her family's story, but also the broader message of victim advocacy and justice reform. Her speeches were powerful, a mixture of raw emotion and clear-eyed determination. Christy would often speak about how the legal system had impacted her family's journey and what needed to be done to prevent such tragedies from happening to others. She would always remind her audience that while justice was essential, it was the victims' stories that mattered most. The most powerful part of Christy's advocacy was her ability to connect with others who had experienced similar trauma. Her public speaking engagements weren't just about talking about Kaylee, they were about reaching out to those in the audience who had suffered. Christy's message was clear: you are not alone. Her voice became a lifeline for other families affected by violence. She offered them solidarity and hope, using her own grief as a way to stand in solidarity with others who had lost loved ones to violence. She wasn't just fighting for Kaylee anymore. She was fighting for every victim whose voice had been silenced. In addition to her speaking engagements, the Goncalves family worked tirelessly to ensure Kaylee's memory lived on. They established memorials and scholarships in Kaylee's name, ensuring that her legacy would never be forgotten. Christy and Steve set up the Kaylee Goncalves Memorial Fund, which provides scholarships to students pursuing careers in criminal justice, something that resonated deeply with Kaylee, who had plans to pursue a career in the criminal justice field. The fund helps young people who want to make a difference in the world, just as Kaylee had hoped to do before her life was tragically cut short. The memorials were not just physical tributes, they became symbols of the fight for justice. The family organized annual vigils where they would invite the community to come together to honor Kaylee's memory. These memorials weren't just about loss, they were about hope and continuing the fight for justice in the face of overwhelming grief. The Goncalves family used every avenue available to them to ensure that Kaylee's light would continue to shine through even the darkest moments. But Christie's advocacy didn't just focus on Kaylee's memory, it also centered on the families of other victims. She became a strong advocate for victim rights, often speaking at events about the need for greater support for families who had suffered similar losses. In one emotional speech, Christie shared, "I don't want anyone to feel the way I feel. I don't want anyone to go through what we've been through. But if they do, I'll be there to help them fight for justice." Her words resonated with families across the country who had experienced similar pain, and Christie quickly became a prominent figure in the victim rights movement. Despite all the public appearances and advocacy work, Christie remained deeply connected to her family. Her commitment to her children never wavered. Kaylee's younger sister, Aubrey, had been particularly vocal in their fight for justice, echoing Christie's sentiment with a powerful statement that was often shared in public appearances. "You may have received A's in high school and college, but you're going to get big D's in prison," she said, referencing the psychological torment Bryan Kohberger was enduring in prison, a statement Christie fully supported. But it wasn't just about public engagement or justice reform, it was also about personal healing. Christie's advocacy was part of her own process of grieving. In each speech, in each interview, she was not just fighting for Kaylee, but also finding her own voice in the process. As much as Christie gave to the world, she was also healing herself, bit by bit, speech by speech, interview by interview. Christie Goncalves' journey of advocacy was just beginning, but as she continued her tireless fight for justice, one question remained. How would her advocacy impact the system and Kohberger's fate moving forward? Would her efforts bring justice not just for her daughter, but for all victims of violent crime? Only time would tell, but Christie was determined that the world would never forget Kaylee's story. In the wake of Kaylee Goncalves' tragic murder, the grief that engulfed the Goncalves family seemed insurmountable. Losing a child, especially in such a violent and senseless manner, is a pain that no parent should ever have to endure. Christie and Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's parents, found themselves in the deepest depths of despair. Yet, despite the overwhelming heartbreak, they began the long journey of navigating their grief and finding ways to keep going. For Kaylee, for each other, and for their family. What they would discover along the way was a resilience born not of denial, but of strength, unity, and the desire to honor their daughter's memory by channeling their pain into something meaningful. The initial shock after Kaylee's death left the Goncalves family reeling, struggling to find their footing in a world that had so suddenly turned upside down. Christie, in particular, experienced the paralyzing weight of grief, each day feeling like a mountain to climb. In those early weeks, Christie often spoke of the overwhelming feeling that, no matter what she did, her life was forever changed. But one of the first things Christie and Steve did in the aftermath was seek support. Grief support groups became an essential part of their healing process. They began attending meetings for families who had suffered similar losses, a community where they could share their pain with others who understood. This collective sharing became a lifeline, a place where Christie could speak openly about her daughter, her loss, and the journey of finding healing after such profound devastation. One of the most important aspects of Christie's coping mechanisms was her ability to lean on the support of her family and close friends. Steve, as her partner, stood by her every step of the way. Their marriage, already strong, became even more unbreakable as they walked through this unimaginable pain together. Christie found strength in the unity of her family, knowing they had to lean on each other to survive this. Despite their heartache, the Goncalves family began to build a stronger foundation of support. They learned how to navigate the chaos of grief together, recognizing that, though the pain might never fully go away, they could continue moving forward together as a family. Christie also found solace in talking about Kaylee, keeping her daughter's memory alive by sharing stories of her laughter, her dreams, and her vibrant personality. She would often speak of Kaylee's love of life, of her kind heart, and the joy she brought to everyone who knew her. Through these conversations, Christie realized that in order to cope, she had to make sure that Kaylee's story didn't end with her death. The pain of Kaylee's murder would never be erased, but Christie was determined that her daughter would not be forgotten. She found strength in telling Kaylee's story, in keeping her legacy alive for others to hear and know. While support groups provided Christy with emotional refuge, the Goncalves family's commitment to advocacy became a way for them to channel their pain into purpose. As Christy became more involved in public advocacy, she found that her own journey of grief intertwined with a larger mission, fighting for justice not only for Kaylee, but for all victims of violent crimes. Her advocacy work gave her a sense of control, a way to process her pain while also making a difference. Kaylee's legacy was woven into every public appearance Christy made, every speech she delivered, every interview in which she shared her daughter's story. One of the cornerstones of the Goncalves family's healing process was community involvement. In the weeks following Kaylee's death, the small town of Moscow, Idaho, was rocked by the loss. But what emerged from the tragedy was a community united in support. Local residents, university students, and other members of the community rallied around the Goncalves family. Fundraisers, vigil services, and other community events were held to honor Kaylee's memory. Christy, always the advocate, used these events as an opportunity to express her gratitude to the community for their unwavering support, and she quickly became an integral part of the healing process for others. Despite the tragedy, Christy and Steve's personal growth was evident. Christy's journey, though marked by heartbreaking loss, was also marked by a growth of inner strength. Together, Christy and Steve found ways to move forward while keeping Kaylee's memory alive. They created a lasting legacy for their daughter through the scholarships and memorials established in her honor, ensuring that Kaylee's bright future lived on even after her death. The establishment of Kaylee Goncalves Memorial Scholarships, which would support students pursuing careers in criminal justice, was a direct way of honoring Kaylee's dreams and ensuring that her death would not define her. Though the pain of Kaylee's loss would never leave them, the Goncalves family began to find a new sense of purpose in the wake of the tragedy. They learned how to navigate grief, finding healing through memorials, advocacy, and public speaking. They understood that their pain, though overwhelming, was not in vain. Their voices, Christy's in particular, became a catalyst for change, pushing for justice and advocating for victims' rights at every turn. The resilience of the Goncalves family was not about erasing the pain of their loss. It was about living in spite of it. Their strength was found in unity, purpose, and the understanding that while Kaylee's absence could never be filled, her legacy would always endure. The Goncalves family's resilience had carried them through the darkest days of their lives, but the battle for justice was far from over. As they continued their fight for accountability, they knew that the journey ahead would be long and filled with challenges. Would the system ever truly provide the closure they sought? The answer would come, but it wouldn't come easily. The media, too, played a crucial role in amplifying the Goncalves family's voice. News outlets, local and national, covered the trial and court hearings extensively, often quoting Christy's statements and her impassioned calls for justice. The case quickly became a national story. Christy's unwavering resolve resonated deeply with the public, and many saw her as a beacon of strength amid the horror of her loss. Her words weren't just about personal grief, they were about the collective pain of all those who had suffered from violence. As the family's advocacy work gained traction, it became clear that Christy had become an essential figure in shaping public perception of the case. Support from the community and beyond was evident in the days, weeks, and months following the murders. Moscow, a small town known for its tight-knit community, rallied around the Goncalves family in a way that no one could have anticipated. Vigils were held in Kaylee's honor, and memorial funds were established to raise money for both the victims' families and for those affected by violent crimes. Kaylee's death, though tragic, had sparked a collective desire for justice and healing. The entire town was mourning, but they were also showing up for the Goncalves family in a way that was unprecedented for a community of its size. What was especially striking was how the public's desire for justice was amplified by the media. The case didn't just capture the attention of Moscow or Idaho, it gripped the nation. The desire for answers was palpable. Social media platforms became rife with theories, but they also became places for people to express their support for the Goncalves family. Hashtags like #JusticeForKaylee and hashtag Justice for the Victims trended across platforms, with thousands of people joining the call for accountability. Christie's voice was amplified by this collective support, and every time she spoke, more people were listening. The media coverage also shifted the narrative from just a tragic story to a movement for victims' rights and justice reform. Christie's words weren't just about her daughter's murder. They were about the need to raise awareness and ensure that no victim is forgotten. Her voice became the face of a larger advocacy movement that reached far beyond the confines of the courtrooms. News outlets began to focus not just on the crime, but on the importance of supporting victims' families through the legal process and ensuring that justice was not just a concept, but a reality. The broader public's response wasn't just limited to words of support. It was also about action. After Kaylee's death, many people across the country came together to form support groups, designed for families who had experienced similar tragedies. These support groups provided a safe space for people to process their grief, share their stories, and advocate for change. Christie, in her interviews, often mentioned how these communities of grief had given her strength, and she would regularly speak about how much the support had meant to her and her family. The outpouring of love and support for the Goncalves family was remarkable, but it also led to tangible change. As a result of the memorial funds and advocacy efforts, new policies were introduced in Idaho to provide better support for victims' families during the legal process. In a particularly emotional moment, Christie shared that Kaylee's legacy would not only be preserved through memorials, but also through the actions taken by the community and by the nation. Kaylee may be gone, but her light will never be extinguished, Christie stated, her voice steady yet filled with resolve. Her statement wasn't just a tribute to her daughter, it was a promise to everyone affected by violence, a promise to keep Kaylee's memory alive and use it to fuel a movement that would ensure no victim would ever be forgotten. As Christie continued to speak out, the collective desire for justice grew stronger. Public support was a crucial part of the Goncalves family's journey, as their grief was met with solidarity at every turn. Christie's advocacy became a catalyst for change, a way to ensure that the fight for justice would continue even after the trial was over. But as the public response grew louder and the calls for justice grew stronger, one question remained. Would the justice they so desperately sought be enough to heal the wounds left by Kaylee's death, or would the fight continue long after the legal battles were over? It is important to remember that Kaylee Goncalves was more than just a victim of a horrific crime. She was a bright, ambitious young woman whose life was tragically cut short. To understand her legacy, one must look beyond the headlines and courtrooms to the memories that family and friends hold dear. Kaylee was a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Someone whose warmth, laughter, and spirit made an impact on everyone around her. Those who knew her best remember a woman full of life, driven by a passion to help others. In the face of immense grief, the Goncalves family, along with those closest to Kaylee, have found a way to keep her memory alive and ensure that her legacy endures. Christie, Kaylee's mother, often reflects on the joy Kaylee brought to their home. Kaylee had this infectious laugh that could light up a room, Christie recalls with a smile despite the pain. She was always the one who could make us laugh, even when we didn't feel like it. I miss that laugh so much. Christie's words are a window into the person Kaylee was before that fateful night in November 2022. She wasn't just a victim of a senseless crime. She was a woman who had dreams, who loved her family, and who was always eager to help others. Kaylee's friends also recall her as a source of joy and support. Kaylee was my best friend, one close friend shared, speaking of the bond they had. She was always there for me. If I had a bad day, she'd be the first person to cheer me up. She just had this way about her that made everything seem better. Kaylee's ability to offer comfort, to be present for those she loved, was something that many of her friends held on to after her death. Her warmth and kindness were qualities that made her unforgettable, and those who knew her felt her loss deeply. But it wasn't just her friends who felt her absence. Kaylee's younger sister, Aubrey, was left to grapple with the loss of her sister in ways only siblings can. Aliva, Kaylee's older sister, also struggled deeply with the loss, and it was their bond as sisters that was so central to their shared grief. Aubrey, in particular, became vocal in their fight for justice, sharing her memories of Kaylee's protective nature. "Kaylee was always there for me," Aubrey said in one of the interviews that followed Kaylee's death. "She was my big sister, and she always made sure I was okay. I just want everyone to know who she was. She wasn't just someone to mourn. She was someone to be proud of." These words, spoken from a place of deep sorrow, are a testament to the lasting bond between sisters, a bond that cannot be broken by death. Christy reflects on her daughter's life, not just the sorrow of her loss, but the joy that Kaylee brought to their family. Kaylee's story doesn't end with her death, Christy says resolutely. Her life was about so much more. She had a heart of gold, and I want people to remember that. To Christy, Kaylee's legacy isn't just about her tragic ending. It's about the life she lived and the impact she had on those around her. In the months that followed, the Goncalves family worked to ensure that Kaylee's name would continue to inspire and be remembered. Not for the tragedy, but for the woman she was. The memorials, scholarships, and advocacy efforts were ways for the Goncalves family to channel their grief into something positive. The Kaylee Goncalves Memorial Fund became a symbol of her dreams, supporting students who wished to pursue careers in criminal justice, just as Kaylee had planned to do. This scholarship not only honored Kaylee's academic achievements, but also her desire to make a difference in the world. It was through these efforts that Kaylee's legacy continued to shine, even in the face of overwhelming sorrow. The Goncalves family's advocacy extended beyond scholarships and memorials. Christy and Steve continued to fight for victims' rights, using their platform to speak out about the importance of supporting families who had experienced similar trauma. Their advocacy work wasn't just about remembering Kaylee. It was about making sure no other family had to endure the same pain. Through their public speaking engagements, Christy and Steve connected with others who had suffered devastating losses. They became voices for justice, pushing for systemic changes that would ensure that victims and their families received the support they needed throughout the legal process. Kaylee's death also led to a larger conversation about public safety and the prevention of violence. Christy's interviews often focused on the importance of community involvement and legislative action to protect victims. She didn't just want justice for her daughter. She wanted systemic change that would prevent future tragedies. Christy's strength in the face of overwhelming grief inspired countless others to take action, to speak up for victims' rights, and to ensure that Kaylee's legacy would live on. But it wasn't just about changing the system. It was about Kaylee's family and friends, who continued to feel the loss every single day. For Kaylee's sisters, her parents, and the friends who loved her, Kaylee's legacy was something they carried with them every moment. The pain of her loss would never go away, but in the actions of the Goncalves family, in the scholarships, in the advocacy, and in the memories shared, Kaylee's light continued to shine. She was remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived, for the love she gave, and for the difference she had made. The story of Christy Goncalves is one of profound loss, unwavering strength, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Through her advocacy, Christy has turned her grief into action, ensuring that Kaylee's memory will never be forgotten. If you found this story compelling, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth true crime documentaries. Join us as we continue to explore the human stories behind the headlines. Thank you for watching.